Welcome back. For the second part of your PowerPoints and video discussion for this weekend, I wanted to talk a little bit about human trafficking in refugee populations. Part of that is because most of my experience with this has been with people who are also qualified to be termed refugees, and I don't think we have a very good understanding of what that means either. So when we look at our lack of understanding for refugees, our lack of understanding for human trafficking, there's a lot of space where we need to learn a lot more. So I'm going to go through another PowerPoint and talk about some examples from both the literature and from work that I've done on what human trafficking might look like in the international realm, and especially as that pertains to refugees. So I'm going to share the screen for that, and we will get started. So we are looking at specifically trafficking in refugee populations and what the implications for that is for social work. And you see on the bottom here, this is another one of the areas that I've worked with a fair amount of people who are trying to get typically to Europe, and they are often smuggled across by people who are exploiting them, taking advantage of the very little money they have, and then put into very dangerous situations. When I was working in Greece and one of the islands there, that was one of the primary entry points for people who were coming from Turkey and from Middle Eastern areas. And there were a lot of people there were so many people that crossed the island from Turkey into Greece that they actually had what was called a life jacket graveyard. And it was just mounds and mounds and mounds, took up acres of space of just discarded life jackets from people who were in a boat such as this. It was kind of heartbreaking and yeah, just something else to see. So, refugee populations. I'm hoping that by the end of this, you'll be able to identify 3 reasons why refugees are particularly vulnerable to trafficking, that this presentation will address major implications of international law relating to refugees and trafficking, and that you'll be able to identify at least 3 challenges of working with refugees who have been trafficked if they actually make it all the way to the United States or anywhere else that you happen to be working. So the first thing that I don't think we often understand is that there's a huge number of people who are refugees. It's right around 22.5, 23 million people right now. That is a huge number of people. About half of these people are under the age of 18, so mostly children. If you look at internally displaced people, which basically is often people who are in refugee-like situations, they're being persecuted for who they are, but they have not left the border of their own country, that adds in another 65 million people. Refugees are often without a long-term home or in a refugee camp. Typically what we hear is that it's 10 to 15 years in a refugee camp before people are resettled. That is assuming they are one of the less than 1% of people that are actually resettled. I met many refugees who had been there their entire lives. They've been there for 20, 25 years, and that was just one specific camp that I worked in. So very long-term settings. Location and safety of refugees is rarely tracked in any kind of systematic way. So it's often, we wouldn't know if someone went missing. In the refugee camps, people often will try to get to another location, another camp, and out of the camp to the city, to try to do something other than sit and wait. But that also means that people are very vulnerable to, if a person disappears in a trafficking situation, they wouldn't necessarily know why or have any recourse of anything to do. Refugees are typically quite desperate for any kind of money, employment, basic needs. In the refugee camps where most people are housed, you are not allowed to leave and you're not allowed to do any outside employment. So other than the very few jobs, maybe if you have skills to work as an interpreter or to work in the schools, there's very few jobs and you're not allowed to leave to do anything else. So people are often taken advantage of because of this. Some families are even forced to sell one of their children so that they feel like they can take care of the rest of the family. That is not an unusual situation in refugee camps or in not just the camps, but some of the more rural or impoverished areas of developing countries. So I think it's helpful to know what the definition of a refugee is, because we have a very inaccurate perception of who are refugees. So the United Nations Convention related to the status of refugees formulated this definition in most countries, including us. We have a almost word for word similar definition, but they state that a refugee is someone who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted, so they have to have reason to fear that they might be persecuted. They don't have to directly be persecuted, but it has to be for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion. So it has to be basically who they are. And they also have to be outside of their country of nationality and not able to return home because they are not going to be protected by the government in their country. Do you want to note that gender is not included as a category? Sexual orientation is not either. There are some cases where that might, legal cases where this is becoming accepted a little bit more often, but it's still not a part of the official definition. So that's just something that's helpful to give you a basis of who actually is a refugee. Second question that kind of goes along with that is who's not a refugee? So anyone who's had to flee their homes, even if it's for the same situations as the refugee, if they have not crossed that international border, they are not a refugee. So the example I give a lot is you could walk 50 miles from Rwanda to Burundi, and that would qualify you to be a refugee. You can walk 500 miles across the Congo. If you haven't crossed that border, you are not a refugee. We often use the term refugee to encompass some of these other categories that are not technically refugees. So people who have left their home countries due to violence in general, gang violence, drug trafficking, or because of environmental disasters, they do not fall under the category of a refugee because they do not have a well-founded fear of persecution based on their identity. They might have very good reason to fear for their safety because of the general situation, but it's not targeted to them because of their identity. Individuals who might be part of the persecuting group will not be considered a refugee. This can be very confusing because sometimes who's in that persecuting group will flip back and forth. Rwanda is a good example of this. We have the Hutus and the Tutsis, who one group was in power and persecuted the other, and then the other group got to be in power, persecuted the first group, and it flipped a couple of times. So even in the refugee camp, you could have people from both populations, but from different periods of time that they left, and now they're in the camp together, which could cause a lot of problems, as you can imagine. So individuals who don't fall into one of those social identity groups also would not be termed a refugee. So remember, this is all very legally oriented. So we're not judging what's happened to them, we're judging legal qualifications for movement or certain kinds of visas. So how are refugees vulnerable in general? So refugees have pretty much all lost their homes and employment. They often have had to flee very quickly, so they might lack papers or any official documents to show their identity, obtain new employment, or legal residency in another country. So you might be a doctor in a country and not have the right papers, or not have those papers qualify you to do the same work in another country. People have often fled to a camp where they have very few resources, or they're still in that process of trying to get to any safe location or country. Very often, they will be reduced to a single parent family, and that might include having multiple children they need to take care of. So many of the people from Burma that we worked with were many single moms with 4 or 5 kids. Some of the families from different parts of Eastern and Central Africa Not as many single parent families that I worked with from there. There were more intact families, but they would have 8 kids. It's a lot of kids to try to take care of and support when you get here, especially with the 2 heartbeat per bedroom rules. So if you have 8 kids and a parent, you need a 5-bedroom house, which is very expensive. Refugees in other locations typically will lack basic needs such as shelter and food. I did my dissertation work in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. The women there all would report that every 14 days they got enough food to last the next 9 days. And then they would have what they call hungry days in between. So if that's the setting that you're in for 10, 15 years, you could very easily get to a place of desperation or hopelessness. So what makes refugees particularly vulnerable to trafficking? So refugees are internationally a very highly vulnerable population for all the reasons that were listed on that previous page. Most refugees are fleeing with very few resources. They're trying to cross the border into another country to seek asylum. Trafficking might take place as refugees try to find a way to get to a new country. This particularly is happening more recently as people try to move into different parts of Europe and the United States. So we're seeing a lot of people who are being trafficked both across land and across water to get to, and the example I was in, get to the first place they could get to in Greece, and then from Greece try to move into a place where they would legally be allowed to stay for a longer period of time. So one author actually stated that refugee survivors of trafficking are triply jeopardized. First, by their treatment, first by their traffickers, second by the host country, and third by their country of origin. So multiple layers of often very traumatizing situations going on. Women and minors make up a very large number of people in the setting. So as we previously said, refugees, half the world's refugees are under 18, so a lot of children. Many women have been separated from their families and their partners. They often have the children with them, but no way to take care of them. Women and minors who might be separated from their families are particularly at high risk. So women and girls who are trafficked often have that additional risk of abuses within the trafficking system, such as sexual abuse and torture. And women and minors are particularly vulnerable due to their gender, cultural, and economic factors. There's increasingly restrictive immigration laws that are providing greater opportunities for traffickers to take advantage of these populations. So in many cultures in Asia and Africa and places where there is a larger number of refugee populations, women are taught to be very submissive to the men in their culture. They are taught to take care of the house, do what they're told to do. They might not have any kind of tradition of earning actual money or income for themselves. They're often seen as dispensable, often seen as not having much value, and easily traded and passed around in a trafficking situation. I did want to show a short video of refugee children from Africa. So I'm going to open this and play the video for you, and then we will return to the rest of the slideshow.
Terrible. This 18-year-old was told to build a fictitious debt. For gangs of people operating. Across the Mediterranean.
If the system of protection and perception
Arising on the wall tells a story. Obviously, Al Jazeera. The arms around the ship.
So, just a visual of some of the situations and ways that refugee children are very quickly and very easily brought into prostitution and other forms of trafficking because they are so vulnerable, and there's just very little tracking. So yeah. I thought I'd also give you a couple of examples just from settings that I've worked in. So I ran a refugee support program in Grand Rapids for 5 years, where we worked with people once they were out of the resettlement process, which is only about 3 months. So people are brought here, given about 3 months of support, and then told to figure it out. This is the gist of our refugee resettlement program. And I will say they do what they can with the resources they have. They just don't have enough resources to do much more than that. So 2 of the individuals I worked with, and I did change their names. One was a young woman from Eritrea, which is a very small country way over in East Africa that many people haven't heard of. And that's actually one of our literature examples that we'll talk about after this. So she was in a situation where she was kidnapped multiple times, and her family was required to raise a substantial amount of money to pay off the people who had kidnapped her to get her to come home. So this actually happened to her twice. The first time her family got the money together and they got it to the people who had kidnapped her, and she went home. Then it happened again, and the second time she eventually ended up in prison. And somewhere along the way, I don't remember exactly the timeline, she actually also got married to another person, not one of the traffickers. So when she was in prison, she was pregnant. She was accepted to come to the United States as a refugee. So she came without her partner and had a child soon after she got to the United States. So she was very fortunate in that her family actually had some resources and were able to pay the ransom the first time. And then the second time, she eventually got to a safe place. When she got here to Grand Rapids, she had an aunt that also lived in the area. So she was able to live with the aunt. The aunt could help with childcare, and she was learning English to try to eventually go back to school. So she had a reasonably good end to her story. She was currently, last time I met with her, waiting for her husband to try to be able to join her, and she was starting to attend a GED program. But her path with the multiple kidnappings and also the imprisonment due to the activities that she was forced to be in was a very long and very traumatizing journey. The other person that I think of when I think of examples of trafficking was a woman who was from the Democratic Republic of Congo. She was in a situation where in the war in the Congo, the guerrillas, not the animals, the guerrilla humans who were fighting against the government, kidnapped her and 4 of her sisters. So all 5 of them were taken to be wives of the men who were in the camps who were doing the fighting, and had a combination of the sexual predating as well as the domestic servitude. So she had multiple layers of that. She eventually escaped. She does not know what happened to her 4 sisters who were also there with her. She eventually made it to the United States and got to have a couple of her, I think her mother and her aunt were here, so she was staying with them. But the things that had happened in the couple of years that she was captured as a wife, and the not knowing what happened to the rest of her family was really hard for her. So she would talk about that a fair amount when we were working together on other things. We weren't working on therapy together. We were doing more case management stuff, but she would talk about what had happened to her and what was going on with her sisters and the worry about not knowing what happened to them. So that was a couple of situations that I had come across just working with the refugees that didn't come here in any kind of easy path. Some of the, okay, I'll give you some examples in a minute. Before we do that, we're going to apply the trafficking definition. So according to the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, trafficking is defined to have 3 elements. And again, this is one that goes back to the UN, so it's a little bit different than the United States stuff we were talking about in the other presentation. There is activities involving recruitment. There is something that has a means of threat or use of force, and that it takes place for the purpose of exploitation. So all 3 of those pieces have to be there for this international version of trafficking. Applying that gets very complicated because of different laws, international laws, different criminal laws, and human rights laws in different countries. So some of the ways these overlaps take place cause difficulty because you don't necessarily know how to approach intervention and how to implement prosecution for those who are involved in carrying out the trafficking. Another challenge is that according to the Refugee Convention, in order to be awarded the refugee status, as we previously talked about, the person has to be able to show that they were persecuted because of their specific identity. In a trafficking situation, that identity piece might not be there, so there might be additional challenges in being able to give people a refugee status to be able to help them to stay in another country. As the perpetrators of trafficking are not very selective, they might target someone as a likely victim of trafficking just to make money. It doesn't matter if they're refugees, internationally displaced people, other definitions, they're just targeting vulnerable people. So combining these in a way that can get them the legal support and the long-term support that they need can be really challenging. We see this in a situation with the Eritrean refugees. So here's one of our examples from the literature. I don't know why, but Eritrea has a lot of the kidnapping and smuggling going on, even compared to other countries in the same area. So in 7 years, there's an estimated 36,000 Eritreans who are smuggled across the border into Israel after being in Sudan or Ethiopia. About a third of these involved abduction or kidnapping, and that forced movement for extortion. Some were sold to criminal gangs, and many of them were tortured while they were waiting for their families to raise that ransom money. Those definitional issues came up when the trafficking definition was used to include recruitment. The individuals were kidnapped, not necessarily recruited. So if we had the kidnapping take place, that first definition piece, that recruitment piece, was not there. And since the individuals didn't have the intention of migration, they're considered victims of aggravated smuggling. That might not meet that definition of trafficking, and that might remove any of those protections under the trafficking laws. So they might not fit the definition of a refugee, and they might not fit the definition of someone who has been trafficked. So both of those layers that could have given them some legal protection could be non-existent. If they're recruited, it has to be clear, if they were recruited for purposes of exploitation, that can be very challenging to prove. When Eritrean asylum seekers were recruited for migratory reasons, the exploitation for ransom money or to intimidate other hostages into paying money does not fit into the examples of exploitation that we've seen in the protocol. So again, they might not actually get any of the support or the legal protection of the definitions that we would like to use to offer people some form of support. Another example was from refugee women from the Congo. So they also tend to experience high rates of forced migration and a lot of sexual abuse. So Congolese people have been migrating within the country for decades because there have been numerous clashes between the government and different rebel groups, and there's also that interethnic clashes in that particular part of the Congo. Rape is often used against both men and women as a war strategy. So it's done specifically under military agreement, specifically for reasons of torture or cleansing or punishing a particular group. So one study was focusing on the experiences of young women in Kigembe refugee camp in Rwanda. 61% of the people in that camp are under 18. And the study found that high numbers of examples by sexual assault by family members. There's also sexual exploitation for money, early forced marriages, and trafficking. The trafficking often takes place when refugees within the camp have outside connections, and then girls are taken, they go missing, they're sold outside the camp situation. So we see that many young Congolese women are kidnapped by a rebel or other ethnic group, and then kind of like the example of the woman I worked with, they were held captive as wives for work and sexual purposes. So how does this fit into the refugee and asylum law in the United States? We do have asylum laws that specifically say we cannot return people home if they are in danger of persecution and the government cannot protect them. That's called forced repatriation. That is illegal under international law. However, having suffered human trafficking does not place these individuals in the category due to their identity. It's the same situations we were talking about before. They could be returned to their home country because they might not have been trafficked because of their specific identity. Courts have ruled that being a woman from a country where trafficking numbers are high does not place them in a special identity category. So that takes away the protection. They're not being targeted because of their identity as a woman, even though they are. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Executive Committee has only ruled that states may take gender into account for considerations of refugee status on the grounds that sexual violence may be a form of persecution. Courts in the United States generally say that that's too broad of a category, that's not acceptable. Women who are trafficked into the United States might be allowed to stay if they can assist in the prosecution of their traffickers, but women who escape trafficking and make their way to the United States for asylum, they're not allowed that offer of protection. So it's only if they were specifically brought to the United States, not that they made their way to the United States after escaping. So the woman that I worked with would not have qualified under that definition. There is a proposed solution to define these individuals as valid asylum seekers having fear of persecution, because when they are returned home, they often face severe societal ostracization and discrimination because they are survivors of sex trafficking. So often, if they actually are able to go home, their community and their family will not accept them. So it's suggested that the courts could make the system as a workaround instead of having them go back home. Due to the current political climate, this is not very likely to happen. We did have a UK tribunal that found that numbers of young women exploited for sex trafficking was a large and specific enough group to constitute a particular social group, and thus met those convention requirements. But the overall case law is very inconsistent. Generally not something that is accepted to give people a status that would allow them to stay in a safer country. There are a couple other legal options. In the United States, we have what's called a T visa that can allow individuals to obtain status equivalent to asylum, so not quite the same, but we give them the same rights under the Department of Homeland Security. But this is limited to those who are under the age of 18 or were forced or trafficked using force, fraud, or coercion. This limits a lot of survivors who might have been lured, deceived, or kidnapped. Survivors also have to cooperate with authorities to persist in prosecution. They may not be able to, they might not have that information, they might be too afraid to, they might be afraid of the repercussions that maybe, again, their families could be threatened. Additional services such as trauma, counseling, or healthcare might be dependent on the individual's willingness and ability to work with authorities. And asylum authorities are often unable to prove any trafficking intention, so applications are denied and survivors are often reported instead of supported. We also have an issue that the cap for T visas is pretty low. It's only about 5,000 a year. The estimated number of women and children that are trafficked to the United States each year is about 50,000. So that leaves a lot of people who have no protection. A couple of guidelines from Michigan. These may have changed in more recent years. This is the most recent thing that I found actual published literature on. Michigan guidelines state that the Refugee Convention lacks any requirements based on intent, that neither the traffickers nor the government that fails to protect the individuals do so for reasons of the person being female, even though it happens that she is. Often the women at risk of trafficking due to severe gender discrimination in the country, again, they're not trafficked because of it, they're just at risk. Women from countries who have attempted to end trafficking could be denied asylum based on the government's efforts. So that's another item to keep in mind. There's a lot of guidelines for how to rule out people. There's not a lot of support for people who are in these kind of situations. So as social workers, a couple of implications to keep in mind. If you encounter individuals who have been trafficked from other countries without the legal authority to stay in the country, it is unlikely they're going to be able to get that authorization. It's not impossible, but it's going to be really hard. Survivors are more likely to be seen as assistants for prosecution, not individuals who need protection, and they often will not feel safe discussing their case. If you're working with refugees or immigrants, know that they might not have disclosed their previous trafficking situation in order to obtain legal permission to be in the country. So it's possible that many agencies are working with individuals without being aware of their trafficking situations. The two women that I discussed were not at our agency because of trafficking. They were there because they came through the refugee resettlement program, and it just so happened that they were also survivors of trafficking. Individuals might be unwilling to discuss their past trafficking or other trauma backgrounds due to a fear of additional persecution. There's been a lot of threats to most of them, and that's hard to undo. And some of it is quite valid. Their families might be at risk of harm. Individuals might fear harm to their families or to their own social status if trafficking or other trauma backgrounds are revealed. Also keep in mind that trauma symptoms from previous situations are likely present and probably not being addressed. So pretty much all of the refugees that I worked with had some form of trauma, whether it was from life in the refugee camp or what took place to get them to the refugee camp. There's a lot of layers of trauma and a lot of very long-term trauma. I worked with a family with 8 children from the Congo, different family, and only the 2 oldest had ever seen or been in their official home country. All of the rest of the kids were born and grew up in the refugee camp, had never been outside of the camp in that country. That's a long time to live in that kind of setting. So keep that in mind as well. There's probably layers of stuff going on that you just don't know about. So with that, we'll wrap up this presentation. We'll give you some time to ask any questions you have tomorrow, our Saturday class, whenever that comes about, if you're doing this earlier than Friday. And yeah, thank you for being here. we will close out this presentation and talk to you soon.